Hello and welcome to week 38's Dinosaur. So another 7 curious, interesting things I saw last week. So let's crack on. So first one. So it's been 35 years since Mario entered the world. Lots of stories around this. However, there's a really interesting game that they released, which is called Mario Kart Live Home Circuit. So this is on the Nintendo Switch, and essentially it comes with an actual remote control car with a camera in it, and you set up these. You can probably just see as you go into these banners, there are some QR code type things on them. So you print these out, you put them around your house, and basically it tracks, therefore, or it creates a track around your house, and then we'll track it with AR through the actual handset itself. So it's really neat. We've seen a few things like this, but never quite to this polished level. So, really interesting view of where, augmented reality games might go in the future with physical toys. So if you're into this, October the 16th, I think, is when you'll see this come out. So check it out. Slightly macabre, gruesome one, but it turns out 100,000 people in the US go missing a year. And there is actually a lab really it's at Tennessee University, and it's called the Body Farm, and it's been there since 1980, and they basically are trying to work out a lot to do with forensics and those sorts of things around when people go missing and they find bodies and how to predict where they'll be and those sorts of things. So there's a really interesting report. It's only really about how you can infer data, and obviously a lot of what we do online is inferring data about people's usage. So I thought this was kind of an interesting anecdote in that when a body decomposes, it actually contains about 2.5 or 2.6 kilos of nitrogen in your body, the average person, and that affects about 3 meters square around you if you're basically in the ground. Anything that grows on top of you can be affected by the nutrients that are in your body. And those can be picked up by cameras. So you can do spectral analysis on the leaves. So for instance, if you were a smoker or you worked in some sort of manufacturing, you might be heavy in cadmium, for instance. That will leak into the soil, any sort of fast-growing plants, so sort of Japanese knotweed, that sort of thing, might pick up those nutrients. If you shone it or put a camera on them, you could then pick up the spectral analysis, the slightly different UV reflections of the leaves, and you could potentially fly over a forest with a very sensitive spectral analysis kind of camera working and spot where there might be suspicious activity. Obviously great for finding sort of lost people that you're looking for, obviously, but I think where this is going, I think I was really interested in the actual anecdotal story of it not necessarily going through the woods looking for bodies. It's actually using a completely different technology. So slightly gruesome, slightly macabre, but quite an interesting story as well. So go and check that out. I mean, it's been there for 40 years, this lab. Anti-procrastination glasses, not really called that, but I thought that's what the article called them. That's why it caught my eye, if you excuse the slight pun. A company called Specs, and this is an Indiegogo campaign, so it doesn't really exist at the moment, but what they're doing is they're basically connecting some glasses with cameras in them to the vision that you're seeing, and therefore they're connecting that to some sort of vision analysis and seeing how much is changing and what scene you're looking at. Now, again, this is nothing new. If you're a life blogger, you would have had a camera maybe 15 years ago that would be looking at your everyday scene, and you could then put it all onto a display at the end of the day and see how your scenes changed. So it's using that sort of technology. But I thought it was quite interesting how with today's working at home and the potential for you to feel that you've got the most productive time out of your day, and on the sinister side is, has your boss or is there a report for your boss that says you were staring at the right thing all day? So as you can see in this is demo, somebody is looking at a book, it's one sort of analysis. They look at their phone, it's another analysis. Somebody walks in and has a chat, it's another analysis. So you can pick up those things whether they're being productive or distracted. So it's kind of neat, maybe great for you personally, but also if your boss insists on this, that could be quite creepy. Talk about this as quite a sinister vibe on this one. There's a really interesting report from Singapore, or some researchers in Singapore at least, about using audio to pick traditional sort of pin and tumbler locks, as they're called. So these are relatively traditional locks. Put a key in, and little sort of pins go up and down based on those waves in the lock itself. Now, if you're into this sort of world, then there's the lockpicking lawyer you should probably be following on YouTube. So there's a whole subculture about locks and picking locks. So this is really interesting because I do follow that culture as well. I do have a set of lock picks around here somewhere, but you didn't hear that. So it's kind of interesting how this works in that if you put an audio device with enough definition to the audio next to a lock, and somebody inserts a key into that lock, a mechanical lock, you can actually hear the pins clicking as you go in, and to what value basically they click at is basically how high the pins go up and down. So researchers have listened within a close proximity of a lock, and then 3D printed a key using the equation you can see in front of you, obviously. Clearly that's the equation you should be using. They 3D printed the key, which then opened the lock. So, for instance, if you find a funny device next to a door or a safe or a locker, that might be what's going on. So you might, as I say, you might want to cough loudly next time you're opening your front door. But really interesting, novel way of getting around a mechanical device using something that is very technological. So VW, I thought this was interesting. It's VW. Obviously, they got caught by basically faking their emissions tests a couple of years ago, and they've had quite a lot of corporate fallout from that and PR fallout. So this is sort of interesting that this came up, but also, if it wasn't VW, you'd saying this is exactly it. So it's slightly cynical. However, VW have appointed RCS Global as their ethical battery supply chain watchdog, I guess. So what that really means is there are two things about EVs. I mean, of course, they're going to save the planet and they're brilliant, but there's a huge environmental cost to actually those batteries. So there is some debate about whether having an electric car is even in the long run a good thing for the environment because of the manufacturing processes that go into the batteries and those sorts of things, and the motors as well. So anyway, so VW have created a watchdog system. So they want to know that their supply chain from essentially mining those two things, which would be nickel and cobalt, for instance. So those two things are critical in batteries. However, if you're in the Democratic Republic of Congo and you are in what they call an artisan mine, so they are unregulated small mines, but the contents goes up to a bigger distributor and so forth, you cannot track the fact that they might have used slave labor, or they might have used unhealthy mining conditions. And likewise, I can't remember what it's called, nickel or nor nickel. You might have seen on the news recently there was a pollution leak in sort of North Russia, and that was by a nickel and cobalt mining company, or nickel in this case, mining company, who have got questionable safety regulations where they can actually release huge amounts of pollution into the environment. So VW have now said, right, we need to make sure our supply chain is ethical and it is recorded on a blockchain, whether people can actually get to view that. So potentially your car in the future might come with a blockchain report, so you can see where every component in your car has come from. So ethical reports on products is really interesting, and therefore you've got consumer choice whether you can actually buy it because you can actually inspect it. Second gaming one and of this week, PacMan. So PacMan is 40 years old. So it was originally Namco 1980, I think it was. So they've used Google Maps to create a new app, which is cool. I think it's either available or will be available soon. And essentially it just uses Google Maps to create the maps of PacMan, the mazes of PacMan. So this is a neat idea in that there are set levels, and you can probably see the Arc de Triomphe and that sort of thing, which make great levels for PacMan. It automatically generates them and sort of simplifies them, a little bit like Pokemon Go, sort of lays a sort of a fake world on top of a real world. But now it's up to the customers and the users and the gamers to try and find a curious and interesting place in their local area that would make really good PacMan mazes. So that's really neat. So all of a sudden, if you know that there's a set of roads around you that would be a brilliant maze, like there is around me, for instance, there's a thing in North London called the Haringey Ladder. Clearly that would make a great maze. So yeah, a really interesting game, and getting more into that. The user is really part of the gaming experience to create the game. And finally, another weird one. But something I did a couple of tweets on a couple of weeks ago, which I thought was really interesting, is when you see faces and you see things in other things that don't really exist. So it's an illusion, essentially. It's called Pariedolia. And there's a really interesting, I think this was about 2 years old, but it just really came to my attention, which was great. Somebody set up this machine, and what it does is it just randomly scatters a very fine mist of sand onto a disc, and then it photographs the disc, and it uses face recognition to try and find faces in the grains of sand. And clearly, I don't know, there's lots of parables and things like that about how many grains of sand there are in the world, and it's essentially close to as infinite as you'll be able to count. It's stars in the sky sort of territory. However, Verstappen, or Dreisens and Verstappen, I'm probably absolutely slaughtering that Dutch name. However, two artists set up these sort of experiments. Really, really interesting to go and see their work. And this is from a couple of years ago, but I just thought it was really interesting. Maybe your face exists in a grain of sand. It's no more tricky than that. As soon as you see this little device on the right-hand side, little hopper full of sand, dribbles it onto this rotating disc. There's a high-powered camera that keeps looking at the grains of sand, and then it just basically has a little sort of a wiper that just wipes it into a barrel at the bottom. They keep filling it up. So who knows what this will find. Maybe there's a face that looks like you. Here are some examples here. So I thought it was really, really interesting experiment using facial recognition, or an abuse of facial recognition, should we say, because it's not going to find real ones. But really interesting nonetheless. And with that, we are done. So thank you very much. It's been an interesting one, slightly curious, and I will see you next week.